answer slowly to the question so that the interpreters can fully interpret your answers. As far as you are concerned, the court here is using 3 official languages, working languages, English, Khmer, and French. Under internal Rule 91bis of the ACCC, the trial chamber first gives the floor to the defense team for Mr. Keo Sompon to put questions to the expert. The combined time for the defense team for Mr. Keo Sompon and Nunchia defense team is 3 sessions. You may now proceed.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to inform the chamber that, as is our custom in this, on this side of the defense teams, Keo Sompon will start and use most of the time allotted for examining the expert, and then would leave the rest of the time to the Nunchia team if it has any follow-up questions for the witness. Good afternoon, Madam Witness. I am Antagise, International Co-Counsel for Keo Sompon, and it is in this capacity that I will put some questions to you. You have told the President of the publication of the first version of your thesis. The book, A Contextual Study into Weddings and Births under Democratic Cambodia, The Ritual Revolution, and it is the book you published, A Contextual Study into the Wedding and Births under Khmer Rouge, The Ritual Revolution. For practical purposes, when I will refer to the first document, E3/1794, I'll refer to your thesis. And if I want to refer to your book published in 2010, I will be referring to your book. I just say so that you should know what I'm referring to, but generally, I will simply refer to your thesis. Let me also recall that I know that you do speak French, and it may well be that you may understand the translations of some of what is said, but may I request you to observe a pause between the questions and any answers you may want to offer for purposes of translation. First of all, regarding your publications, your thesis and your book of 2010, can you tell the chamber what are the essential differences? Are there many differences between your book published in 2010 and the thesis? What are the differences between the 2 publications? Are there any additions in the subsequent publication?
Yes, my first answer relates to an unfinished question in the first session. My PhD thesis has 178 references in the bibliography, and my book has 184, so several more. There were a couple of other publications that came out between the time that I submitted my thesis. The thesis is submitted and goes for a period of time. And in Australia, our theses are sent out to international examiners, so it takes a while for them to come back. So from the time I submitted my thesis in 2006, it did not really finish its completion until 2007. So between that time of 2006 and the time my book came out, that was submitted for publication in 2009, that takes a year. In that time frame, I added 7 more publications. Most of those were documents that were in the media where the word forced was used. The difference between the PhD thesis and the book is the audience. So for example, knowing that I would expose myself a bit and become a bit vulnerable if I published my data for other researchers to have access to, I made the decision to do that in my thesis. And so the end of my thesis has 192 from my formal sample with a synopsis around the data, whereas the book has just my first sample of 11 couples, 22 subjects, and their summarized data. There's less detail around my literature review in the book than there is in the thesis, and perhaps less analysis where the reader can follow the steps by which I came to conclusions in the book than there is in the thesis. Those would be the major differences.
Donc si je dois résumer, ça...
If I were to sum up what you have just stated, your book focuses on a bigger segment of public, and your thesis is more scientific and contains more details. Should I say so as a way of summarizing what you've just said?
With that, and I would add one more thing, that my book allows, my thesis allows the reader to see the steps by which I moved my methodology forward from a sample that was selective to a sample that was random for more generalization across the population. That would be another major difference.
Je vais précisément...
I will specifically refer more at length to your methodology subsequently. But before I get there, I would like to put a question regarding your life experiences, your background. We have in your file your resume in its entirety and the list of your numerous publications. And to inform the Chamber, I'm referring to document E3/433.1. You did philosophy, medical anthropology, and sociology. My question to you is as follows. In the manner in which you conducted your research, did you apply the research methods in all those disciplines, or did you focus on a particular area? I'm talking of your thesis here.
Okay, I have to see it. That's it. Thank you. My apologies. My research and thinking and analysis on a regular basis is informed by a multidisciplinary foundational background, I might say. When I started my PhD and I was at Victoria University, I had to qualify as an anthropologist with regard to my capacity to understand and operationalize ethnography. After doing that and then transferring to Monash University into Monash Asia Institute in Asian Studies, the second half of my thesis, I think, was much more multidisciplinary, but I did follow the foundational principles of ethnographic research from an anthropological background.
Je suis désolée, c'est que des fois, enfin...
I am sorry. If I may sound perplexed sometimes, it is because I have to follow the interpretation, and sometimes the terminology is not always easy. I have another question. The title of your thesis is a PhD in philosophy, Doctor of Philosophy. I do not know whether it's philosophy in the same sense in French, which is a lot more restrictive than anthropology. Is a meaning in English studies different from the meaning in French? Can you be more specific on that subject?
The Australian PhD, Doctorate of Philosophy, very much follows along the lines of the American PhD, which means that you can do a doctorate of philosophy and specialize in a specific discipline.
Je vous remercie de ces précisions.
Thank you for this clarification. I'd like us to look at your research approach. You also say in the foreword to your thesis things regarding the manner in which you tackled marriage. You said you came to Cambodia to work in another area, and it was only following some discussions you had with your colleagues that you became interested in the specific subject of marriage. You said, and you pointed out again this morning, that initially you had this bias a priori, saying that marriages under democratic Cambodia were forced marriages. And during your discussions with your colleagues, you looked at the subject from another standpoint, and your reflections and approach changed. My question is as follows. In light of the bias you had initially and the research standpoint you adopted, what was the approach you adopted ultimately? How did you envisage the research, and what precautions did you take in order to examine the subject as objectively as possible?
Pay more attention. At first, I startled myself by stumbling upon a belief that I had that I couldn't validate. That was the first moment for me, because I consider myself to be a rational person who tries to weigh many different sides of a story before I have an opinion. So I realized in that moment when my Cambodian colleagues, who through their lived experience challenged me, that I had some work to do to track how it is that I came to believe this. Now, if I can digress for a moment, in 1980, when I first was working with Cambodian refugees in the United States, the first wedding stories that I heard in the United States were not from Cambodia. The first wedding stories I heard when I was in the United States that led me to do research on Cambodia were two people, a man and a woman, who were clients of mine in a mental health center, who told me about their wedding in the refugee Thai border camps. So people were in the Thai border camps for long periods of time. This particular couple wanted to marry. They met each other in the camps and they wanted to marry. And they were told that they had to marry in a Christian service so that they could be registered for host country passage. And when they came to me, they were very confused about their identity. They felt Buddhist on the inside, but in order to have particular services, they acted Christian on the outside. They never had a traditional ceremony in that context. It was that first case of hearing that wedding in that context that led me to start reading on Cambodia. And in my readings on Cambodia, I came across documents such as work by Elizabeth Becker, who used the word forced. So I was reading a lot of historical documents in many different places trying to get information. And the word forced, I think, subliminally just stuck with me. But when I was challenged by my colleagues when I came to Cambodia the first time, having only had experience of Cambodian refugee narratives being told to me, after that time, that's when I decided to go back into those historical documents and to see, was there a study done on this subject? If there was a subject done, was it done with multi-phased sampling rather than judgmental or selective sampling? So that's what started me on this project. And admittedly, when I started to get more and more data to the contrary of the word forced, and things were starting to brew a bit in Cambodia about the subject, and there were early solicitors, lawyers who were looking at that problem and sometimes seeking me out for conversation. I discovered in those conversations that oftentimes my topic of inquiry was less than appreciated, which then gave me more determination to move forward with a PhD on this topic. I hope that answers your question.
Oui, en partie.
Yes, partly. And the part underpinning my question was as follows. As regards your recollections in that regard, I don't know whether the term burning was a source of discussions. Was it something debatable as regards the subject of marriage under democratic Cambodia? How did you start your research, and what precautionary measures did you take in order not to rely on a preconceived idea, but to rely on the material you had at your disposal? I hope my question is clearer.
Sorry.
C'est vrai, il y a toujours ce délai.
It is true that you always have to observe this pause to allow for translation both in English and in Khmer.
I started my research by dividing it into 3 phases. The first phase was exploratory. So I'd like to clarify, the first doctoral study that I did was a pure quantitative study, but now I was moving into a qualitative study. And in order to do a qualitative study, one requires a lot of measures to make sure that study is reliable and valid. So in that regard, I decided to do my study with what can be called multi-phased sampling. I chose my first sample with only 2 criteria. I wanted to interview couples who were together, in part so I could have male and female and find consensus between the 2 if I spoke to them individually and then compared their stories. And secondly, the other criteria that I had was that they were married inside Cambodia and had no refugee status, so which meant I did my study inside Cambodia. Those are the only 2 overriding criteria that I selected for my sample. And so then I went from a purposive sample that was selective, and I would like to qualify selective sampling because one can approach selective sampling from 2 perspectives. Purposive sampling, excuse me, from 2 perspectives. One is selective and one is judgmental. Sometimes in qualitative research, a researcher will choose a judgmental approach to a study because they want to canvass, let's say, somebody wants to study opinions about abortion in a country, so they might select a sample from either a pro-abortion NGO or an anti-abortion NGO just to be able to get a sense of the influence, if you will. I chose to not use a judgmental sample as my first port of call. I chose to use a selective sample, which is used in early stages to explore a phenomenon. So I was looking at this phenomenon called weddings under DK. So in that regard, I chose couples so that I could understand how they experienced the weddings, where they experienced them, how they described them without me influencing that description, asking questions that were not leading from a selective perspective, and trying to get a sense of couples who were married in the same places with different leaders. So I might be able to understand within a village structure what influences there may have been that interacted with my respondents' experiences. So that was how I originally chose my first sample. Now, I will say that my first couple that I traveled with was a convenience couple. So under selective sampling, we can choose a selection of convenience. The reason I chose this one couple was because it was the first couple that challenged my use of the word forced. So I chose them as the first couple to travel with, to interview 3 times together separately to get a sense of the consensus. I traveled to the work camps with them where they were. One was in the boys' camp and one was in the girls' camp. And then I heard their story at their camps about how they were each called for a wedding. I traveled with them to the wedding site in a village where there are other people living who were married in that same place at different times. And I traveled with them the road they took, that they walked the night after they were married, when they were told that they could go to the woman's parents' home to stay for 3 days. So that was my first sample. Again, a sample of convenience, so I could really just get more of a sense of where I was going to go next. Then I moved that into the second phase, which going from a convenient sample to a selective sample. What I discovered when I was in that village was that there were other couples that had been married there